So you would like to learn Spanish, but you think that Spanish is this super weird, exotic language. But actually, Spanish and English are not that different from each other. They actually hold many similarities. And that's because they actually, even if you don't believe me, they actually belong to the same family. They are not brothers per se, but Spanish and English are still closely related. You can think of them as maybe cousins. And that's the reason why actually Spanish and English have lots of similarities and why you shouldn't be afraid of Spanish because it has many things that are easy to recognize for you as an English speaker. So I know that Spanish doesn't sound the same and Spanish doesn't look the same as English, but there are certain patterns that they have in common. And in this video, I'm going to present you a way in which you can easily transform English words into Spanish words following certain patterns, okay? The patterns that I'm going to show you, they usually work like 80% of the time. So it's not something perfect. It has certain exceptions, of course, but it tends to work most of the times. It tends to be quite constant. So, okay, I'm about to show you some patterns that are easily translated into Spanish if you follow a certain rule. So the first rule that I would recommend you to follow is the Xian rule. So we have Xian, a lot of words in English that end with Xian. In Spanish, they tend to end with Sion. Okay, they tend to be almost exactly the same, but instead of Xian, they end with Sion. Some examples of this are the first one that we have here is action. So action, so we have Sean right there. Action in Spanish is acción. Okay, acción. So we have action, and the Sean we just transform that into sion, and in Spanish we have acción. So that's pretty much like the big change, but it's really easy to recognize. So okay, Sean, so I know that in Spanish must end with sion. But an important thing to keep in mind is that, for example, we have action, and in Spanish we have acción. There's a small change in pronunciation or intonation in the syllables of these two words because in English we have action, so the a is the strong sound of the word. So we have action. However, in Spanish it's a little bit different. In Spanish we have acción, acción. So the O is actually the strongest sound of the word. So action in English, acción in Spanish. And we have exactly the same thing with education, okay? So we have education, education. And in Spanish, that Sean just changes to Sion, and that's it. You have the Spanish translation right there. Educación. Educación. And as you can see, the pronunciation is a little bit different. You have education. The A is the strongest sound, but once again, in Spanish, the O is the strongest sound. Educación. Education, educación. The same thing happens with creation. Creation, you change that shan into sion. Creation, creación. Creation, creación. So we have action, which is acción, education, which is educación, creation, which is creación. Now I will challenge you to figure out how you would say nation in Spanish. So it follows exactly the same rule. Nation. How would you say nation in Spanish? So the way that you would say nation in Spanish is actually nación. Nación, okay? And it follows the same rule. It's exactly the same thing. Nation, nación. So that is the first pattern right there. Sean turns into sion with a lot of words, okay? A lot of words that tend to end with "tion." In Spanish, they tend to be almost exactly the same, but they end with "sion." So that's the first little rule there. The other rule, the next rule, has to do more with adverbs. And in English, usually adverbs end with ly. Spanish uses adverbs in a similar way, and in Spanish, the adverbs tend to end with mente. So in the first example, we have easily, easily. So if you know that in Spanish easy is fácil, and you also know that li is mente, okay, so you want to say easily, you would have to say easy, and li, you know that easy is fácil, li is mente, so easily is fácilmente, okay? Fácilmente. You just add the mente at the end, and that's it. Hardly, it's the same thing with hardly. Hardly, you, if you know that hard in Spanish is difícil, and you know that li is mente, well, hardly is difícilmente, okay? And that's pretty much it. Something similar happens with honestly. Honestly, honestamente. So that li at the end transforms into mente. So now a challenge for you is to figure out how would you say totally in English. It's exactly the same rule. You're following exactly the same rule. How would you say totally in Spanish? So totally would be simply totalmente. And that's pretty much it. Li turns into mente. Easily, fácilmente, hardly, difícilmente, honestly, honestamente, and totally, totalmente. And that's the second little rule. The next one has to do with certain nouns that in English end with ty. In Spanish, usually they are quite similar, but they end with that or that. Some examples of this are society. In Spanish, is almost the same thing, but T changes to that, so it would be sociedad. Society, sociedad. Now we have liberty. Liberty is almost exactly the same, but T changes to that, so it would be liberty. In Spanish is libertad. Something similar happens to activity. Activity changes to that in Spanish, so activity is actividad. So following this pattern, how would you say community in Spanish? So the way that you would say community in Spanish is comunidad. Comunidad. And that's the pattern right there. T ends with that or tad in Spanish. So the next little rule that we are going to learn is words in English that end with ism. Usually, almost always in Spanish, they end with ismo. And for this, you have words such as capitalism. In Spanish is almost exactly the same. Capitalismo, you just add the ismo at the end. Capitalism, capitalismo. Communism, in Spanish is comunismo. And another thing that changes is that in Spanish we hardly use double consonants. It's not a typical thing to to write in Spanish. The only double consonants that you're going to encounter a lot in Spanish are double R's and double L's, but and that's pretty much it. But things like double M's are they just don't exist in Spanish. So communism, comunismo, then we have romanticism, is pretty much exactly the same thing, but with O at the end, romanticismo. And following this pattern, how would you say cubism? Cubism, how would you say that in Spanish? Well, the way that you would say cubism in Spanish is just cubismo. Okay, cubismo. And that's pretty much it for this rule. It's quite a simple rule. The next one has to do with words that end with east. In Spanish, they tend to end with ista. An example of this is the word artist. In Spanish, it's almost exactly the same thing, but instead of ist, it's going to be ista. So we have artist, in Spanish is artista. Dentist, dentista. Guitarist, we have guitarrista. You have that double R there, guitarrista. Guitarist, guitarrista. And following this logic, how would you say activist in Spanish? Yep, that's right. Activist would simply be activista. And that's pretty much it for this rule. Ist turns into ista. Artist, artista, dentist, dentista, guitarist, guitarrista, activist, activista. And the final little rule that I have for you is, well, in Spanish, words that tend to end with or, in English, in Spanish also tend to end with or. And some examples of this are actor in English, but in Spanish you would say, yeah, in Spanish is the same. That would be a yes and a no. It's the same, but if we're talking about pronunciation, it's not exactly the same. Because in English is actor, however, in Spanish is actor, okay? Actor. So the emphasis is in the last syllable in Spanish. It's always in the last part. It's always in this part. This is the emphasis that I want you to make in Spanish. Because in English is actor. The emphasis is more in the first syllable, actor. But in Spanish, the emphasis is in the last syllable, actor. Okay? Exactly the same thing happens with factor. Factor in Spanish is factor. Factor. So you have to make an emphasis in the last syllable. Factor. 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 You're making like an emphasis in English in the first syllable. In Spanish, you have to say factor, the last syllable. And then here you have humor. Humor. And as you can see in Spanish, it looks exactly the same, but the pronunciation is different. Humor, and in Spanish is humor, okay? Humor. Humor, humor. And by the way, in Spanish, the H doesn't have a sound at all. So never pronounce the H. Just ignore the H and pronounce the next thing. The next thing to the H. So humor is humor. Again, create an emphasis in the last syllable. And finally, following this logic, how would you say constructor in Spanish? So the way that you would say constructor, I mean, if you write it, it's exactly the same word. However, the pronunciation changes to constructor. Okay? Constructor. Constructor, constructor. So we have actor, actor, factor, factor, humor, humor, and constructor, constructor. So that is all of the little secrets that I have for you. If you like to, here I have some exercises for you in which you have to translate these words into Spanish. So we have fraction, completely, celebrity, civism, pianist, and author. You must translate those into Spanish. And if you want to see the correct answers, you can look at them at the description of this video. So thanks a lot. Muchas gracias for watching this presentation. And if you like to learn a little bit more of Spanish or maybe have some private Spanish online lessons, you can go to my website SpanishAttack.com. Muchas gracias y nos vemos pronto. Thanks a lot and I hope to see you later.